I'm really sorry for anything I've done to disappoint you, I groaned to my parents. I looked out the van window. The warm afternoon sun was shining down onto carefree people walking the sidewalks. I couldn't believe this was it. I only got to live for 17 years. From this near death experience, I learned that I need to know my limits and stay within them. When I started my senior year in high school, I was way behind the rest of my class. I really poked around during the first few years of high school. Also, I went with my parents to Kiev, Ukraine at the end of my 10th grade year. My dad was serving as a pastor at a mission church on the outskirts of the city. My pokiness and being gone all added up to my being far behind. I don't think you can make it this year, Chris, my teacher told me. Why don't you try to graduate next school year? Game on, I thought. I would show him. I worked really hard that year. I worked very fast at the beginning of the school year. However, as the year moved on, I realized I had to work even harder and faster. I shifted into a fever pitch. I began doing some really unhealthy things. In my parents' medicine cabinet, I found a bottle of caffeine pills called No-Dose. I began taking those late at night to help me stay awake and keep working. I started sleeping on the floor of my bedroom with the lights on to keep me from sleeping too long. I kept getting more and more desperate. By the last week of the school year, I saw that I could make it. I could get all my work accomplished and qualify to graduate if I really worked hard that week. But I still had several big assignments to complete. After I got home from the second to last day of school, I decided I wouldn't sleep until I had those assignments finished. So I got the bottle of No-Dose and I got to work. As the hours wore on, I began feeling tired, so I began taking pills. As the night kept going, I began feeling exhausted, so I kept taking pills. Now, each of those No-Dose pills has the same amount of caffeine as a cup of coffee. By early morning, I had taken 12. That's way too much caffeine. Around 2 or 3 o'clock, I realized that I wouldn't be able to finish my assignments that night, so I decided to go to bed. Hopefully, my teacher would let me hand in my assignments late. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. My mind began playing tricks on me. I began having strange thoughts. So I decided to take a shower, but that didn't help. The whole world began feeling strange. I felt like I was falling down a deep, dark hole. I stumbled upstairs and woke up my mom. I don't feel well, I told her. She got up and told me to lie down on the recliner. She and my dad began asking me questions. I couldn't answer them. My dad called the school to tell them that I wouldn't make it in for the last day. Meanwhile, my mom kept checking on me on the recliner. I kept sinking deeper and deeper into the black hole. By early afternoon, I couldn't talk anymore. I couldn't stand. What on earth was happening? My mom panicked. She called my dad, who called an EMT friend of his. He and the EMT came to see me. You better take him to see a doctor, the EMT said. My mom, dad, and older brother carried me into our minivan. I kept sinking further and further into darkness. I summoned up the strength to tell my mom and dad I loved them. This was it. I was going to die. Dr. Brown took my vitals. Take him to the hospital right away, he said. My parents drove me straight to the emergency room. Several nurses helped move me to an ER bed. They hooked me up to a bunch of machines. It all seemed like some crazy nightmare. What's wrong with him? The ER doctor asked. My parents tried to explain. They felt terrible. How could they let this happen? The ER doctor watched over me for a while. I don't know how long. She made sure my heart was beating like it should. She did some tests. By this time, I began feeling like I was crawling back up out of the dark hole. When I felt somewhat better, the doctor came into my room to explain what was going on to me and my parents. He's not been living a healthy lifestyle, she said. He isn't sleeping enough. He consumes way too much caffeine. The last few months have totally wrecked his hormone levels. Take him home. Make him sleep. Everything will settle down with some rest. A short time later, I walked out of the ER and into the cool evening air. I had made it. I didn't die. A few days later, I walked up onto the stage. I couldn't stop a huge smile from appearing on my face. Congratulations, said the principal. I took my diploma and shook his hand. I had made it. I learned from this experience that you have to know your limits. Was the diploma worth all the work? Yeah, but not the way that I did it. I learned that getting things accomplished through hard work is important, but living a healthy lifestyle within healthy limits is even more important. That is an example of a personal essay. I just wrote it myself. A personal essay. That's what you're going to be doing this week. So let me go over what a personal essay is exactly. So a personal essay essentially starts with you thinking about an experience that you've had that taught you some sort of lesson. Now, sometimes when I talk to students about this, they say, well, nothing exciting has ever happened to me. I haven't had a near-death experience or anything like that. And I haven't had anything that's worth talking about. And so I have a couple of things to sort of push back on there. So first off, I have learned as from studying history that some of the most interesting aspects of history are not actually found in big exciting things, but in small, what we would consider boring things. So let me give you an example. So if I would talk to you about the Civil War, I could tell you all about the different battles that were fought, the politicians who fought the battle as well in Congress or in the presidency. I could tell you all about the different policies and the different causes of the Civil War. I could really give you a lot of facts about things like that because I really enjoy American history and have studied the Civil War quite a bit. My guess, though, is that some of you may find that interesting, but some of you may also not find that very interesting. If I would instead talk to you about what it was like to be a soldier living in the camp, you might find that somewhat more interesting. If I told you about the kinds of food that the soldiers ate, if I told you about the kinds of clothes they wore, and the kinds of practical jokes that they liked to play on each other, I'll bet you would probably enjoy that. Now, you'd probably even enjoy it even more if I would actually play you some of the songs that they used to listen to when they had free time, or the songs that they would sing when they were marching. You would probably kind of enjoy that. And so those things like the practical jokes, the clothes they wore, the music they listened to, those are things that you would consider kind of like the boring little details of life that no one really cares about, but you would probably find that more interesting even than the big overarching more exciting things, right? So the same thing can be true in your lives too. So do exciting things have to happen to you to make them be interesting? No, actually not. Some of the most interesting things about your life are actually found in the nitty gritty little details. So don't just look for the exciting things in your life. Look for the times where you found or where you learned something from something that happened to you. It doesn't have to be exciting; it just has to be something that you learned, or a time that you learned something. Okay, so here's how you're going to start to write your personal essay. You're going to pick an event that happened to you from which you learned something. So think about a couple of these questions. Have you ever done something that you instantly regretted? If you did, that might be a clue that this would be a great story to use. 2, have you ever experienced something that had a lasting effect on you? Right? Like, so in my case, I gave you the example of when I had way too much caffeine and had a really unhealthy lifestyle. That absolutely had a lasting effect on me. Have you had a similar experience of some kind? 3, is there a daily routine that has taught you a lesson, right? Is there anything you're working on, like trying to sleep, 8 hours a day, or is there some habit that you're trying to form or something that has kind of taught you a lesson? 4, have you had an experience that caused you to change your attitude toward a particular person, place, thing, or idea? That's a great question. Have you ever changed your mind about anything recently? Well, what caused that to happen? And 5, have you had an experience that promoted a positive character trait such as determination, punctuality, or honesty? Okay, so think about those 5 questions. Those are just some questions to help get you started thinking. So you got to pick some sort of story, some sort of personal experience that happened to you. Now, the second thing you have to also decide on here is a thesis. And I know we've worked a lot on thesis statements, but this particular thesis statement will be quite a bit easier to write than a lot of the thesis statements that we've worked on so far this year. And so let me just go back to my personal essay here and give you my thesis statement. It's this: from this near-death experience, I learned that I need to know my limits and stay within them. So you're going to have a similar thesis statement like that, like something like, from this experience, I learned that I should always brush my teeth, or something like that. So you're just telling people what you learned. All right? So you got to pick those 2 things. What is something that happened to you, and what did you learn from that? So that's going to be the first step. The first 2 steps. Selecting your story, and then step 2 would be deciding what your thesis is. Okay. Now, step three is going to be to organize your ideas. Now, this is going to be pretty straightforward because you're just going to tell the story in chronological order. And I've noticed from working with students and writing over the years that this is something that students do pretty much naturally. You don't have to coach students. I haven't had to coach students how to write in chronological order. So this is something that you're just going to do naturally anyway. Just tell the story in the order that it happened. Okay, step four. This is then the form that you should use to write your essay. You're going to start off with an introduction. Now, that's something you're pretty familiar with. We've been doing that all year, starting off with an introduction of some kind. Now, I have a couple of, I have something that I would like for you to all try. So there are different kinds of attention getters that you can use to kick off a personal essay, but I'm going to have you all try using what I think is one of the most interesting ones. So if you notice, when I jumped into my own personal essay, I actually jumped into the story about halfway through. This is how it starts. I'm really sorry for anything I've done to disappoint you. I groaned to my parents. I looked out the van window. The warm afternoon sun was shining down onto carefree people walking the sidewalks. I couldn't believe this was it. I only got to live for 17 years. Okay, so that's like right smack dab in the middle of the story when my parents are transporting me from home to the doctor's office. And that's the time when that's the moment when I thought that I was going to die. So I would like for you to do the same thing where you select a piece of the action that happens somewhere partway through the story, somewhere close to sort of the climax of the story, and you kind of give us a little peek toward what that climax is going to be, and then you tack on the thesis statement. So I just read this just to you again, so I'm not going to read it to you again, but just remember that I gave you some hints about what was coming. I tried to really get your attention by telling you I thought I was dying, and then I gave you my thesis statement, which was, from this near-death experience, I learned that I need to know my limits and stay within them. So that's a really great way to catch people's attention. I'm going to give you one other example of this, just to show you a different, just to show you one more example. And that was this. So I love to listen to a particular podcast called American Scandal. And the series that I have been listening to over the last couple of weeks is about an incident that took place in Waco, Texas, where there was a sort of a splinter group of a splinter group of a splinter group of a splinter group of the I think the Jehovah's Witnesses. Ooh, boy, I think I'm not quite. No, I can't quite remember. Whatever. Some religious, somewhat Christian religious group, Christian-based religious group, and they were called the Branch Davidians. And the leader of the Branch Davidians, whose name was David Koresh, thought that he was Jesus. And he was planning, he thought that Revelation was talking about him and about bringing about some sort of judgment on the earth. And so he was storing a bunch of weapons there in Waco, Texas. Well, the different government agencies found out about this and then stormed the place there where he was staying with his followers. And a lot of terrible things happened. So the way that this whole series was kicked off was like this. Almost immediately, as soon as the podcast series began, they took you right to one of the most climactic moments when the agents are rushing in to try to take over the Branch Davidian place there. And it talks about some of the things that are going on. There might be some gunfire or something. And like, that's how this whole thing starts. And then as soon as they've got you hooked, then they jump way back in the story and start with David Koresh when he's in high school, or when he's a young boy, I think. And so that's a really effective way of catching people's attention. And so that's what the point of this is too. You want to hook people's attention right away, and then you want to whack them with the thesis statement and say, this is what I learned, and now people are so interested in the story that they're going to read the whole thing, right? And so you'll notice that in my story, I told you about how I thought I was dying, then I jumped way back to the beginning of my senior year in high school. All right, I want you to do the same thing as well. That's going to be paragraph number 1. Then the body of your personal essay is going to consist of you simply telling the story of what happened. Now, one thing that students sometimes struggle with when they're trying to tell stories in chronological order especially stories about themselves, is they don't quite understand how to break the story up into paragraphs. And so when you're telling a story, it's not quite like trying to give information, because when you're giving information, you start with a topic sentence and then you give the information that matches up with that topic sentence. And once you're finished with that topic, you move on to the next paragraph. So you've kind of figured that one out to some degree. This is different. Since it's a story, you actually have to break up the story into paragraphs that make sense. And so you're going to have to use kind of your own sense of when it's time to break things up. Now, I just went through an exercise like this with the high school students, and so I had to for some of them, when I was editing their paragraphs, I kept making markings saying this is where a new paragraph should start. Like, you really need to cut this thing up. And so if you're trying to decide, should I start a new paragraph, should I not start a new paragraph, probably you should lean toward just starting a new paragraph. Okay. Now, you're going to just develop your story then. You can take as many paragraphs if you want, as many words as you want, to do that. But then at the very end, you're going to tack on a conclusion. Now, let me read my conclusion to you. A few days later, I walked up onto the stage. I couldn't stop a huge smile from appearing on my face. "Congratulations," said the principal. I took my diploma and shook his hand. I had made it. Okay, so I finished the story off, and that's how you're going to have your conclusion start as well. You're going to conclude your story. Then you want to restate your thesis and say, and which I said in this case, I learned from this experience that you have to know your limits. Was the diploma worth all the work? Yes, but not the way I did it. I learned that getting things accomplished through hard work is important, but living a healthy lifestyle within healthy limits is even more important, right? So I restated my thesis there, but I said it in different words, which is what you're supposed to do with the thesis at the end of a personal essay. So you're going to conclude your story and then restate your thesis there. That's going to be the conclusion. Okay, so let me just recap everything so far. Step 1 is going to be to select a story that happened to you. Step 2 is going to be to pick the lesson that happened, that you got from that particular thing that happened to you, and that's going to be your thesis. Step 3 is going to be organizing your ideas, and that simply means saying your ideas in chronological order. Step 4 then is using this pattern to write your essay, and that would be to start with an introduction. But I want you to start to use the attention getter of starting part way through the action, and then at the end of that introductory paragraph, you need to put your thesis there. We say, this is what I learned from this. Then in the next part of the essay, you're going to simply tell what happened in chronological order, and then third, you're going to write your conclusion, and you're going to conclude your story and then restate what you learned from that story. Okay, so you need to have an essay here that consists of at least 3 paragraphs, which would be an introduction, the middle, and the conclusion. And you need to have at least 150 words. Okay, so got to have at least 3 paragraphs, at least 150 words. That is what I'm looking for. I'm really looking forward to hearing these, or to getting these from you. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me, either by text or by call. I'll be very happy to help you out. Okay, Mr. Chris, out.